Hello and welcome to The Arise interview, 60 glorious minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next hour, how far has the US managed to confront its terrible legacy of slavery and racial violence? Some say America has failed to deal with it, and that the legacy of slavery lingers on in the country's ghettos and in Donald Trump's America today. But others insist that affirmative action in the US has helped to put in place a set of laws, policies, guidelines, and administrative practices intended to correct and end the effects of racial discrimination, and that nothing more needs to be done. So who's got the right of it? As Black History Month comes to an end in Europe and across the world, we'll get to grips with this vexing issue in a moment. In the whirlwind of current US politics and Donald Trump's America, it's important to maintain a sense of perspective and balance. That means a proper understanding of history. But how hard is that to achieve in the current political climate in the US? How much has America continued to disremember the memory of the legacy of slavery and racial violence, an original sin that left an indelible imprint on that nation's soul? Well, history tells us that a terrible price had to be paid in a tragic civil war before the US, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal, could be rid of the institution of slavery. But for Black Americans, the end of slavery was just the beginning of their quest for democratic equality, and another century would pass before the US came to embrace that goal. But even now, millions of Americans of African descent still languish in the country's backwaters. And today, under President Trump, the race problem is still America's greatest national dilemma, an issue which continues to pose a threat to its democratic experiment. We'll discuss all that in a moment. But first, here's a quick history lesson and a reminder of what the African slaves faced after they were forcibly taken away from the continent.
To slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded. They were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
A little bit of a history lesson there. To discuss the history and current status of race relations in America, I'm joined now from our London studios by the African-American musician and rights campaigner Gregg Kofi Brown, and in the Abuja studio by the author and professor of political science and black studies Emeka Aniagolu, who for many years taught African and African-American history at Ohio Wesleyan University in the US, and by the Jamaican Nigerian international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's go straight away, first of all, to London. And Gregg, thank you for joining us. Set the scene for us as an African-American yourself. I mean, is America facing up to the horrible parts of its past and the horrible crimes that it's committed against black people in that country, or is there continuing sort of resistance to that process of facing up to that ignoble past?
Well, on two issues, in terms of education and economic freedom, there is a case to say that certain sectors of America are being have a positive influence, but I think generally, I think the legacy still lingers. I think there's very little development from a socio-economic point of view. They let a few of us through, but the majority of us are left to, suffer in rundown neighborhoods and cities that are being abandoned by the middle classes.
And so, I mean, Professor Emeka, you're obviously a historian of African-American history. The conclusion from all of this is that with regard to slavery or Nazism or tribalism, for that matter, in a country like Nigeria, really learning from history is not a comfortable process. I mean, it is a very slow, very painful, and very difficult one.
It is, and there's always the danger of amnesia from not keeping people informed about history. And we see the consequences of that in our own country here. And certainly the case where I taught lots and lots of African-American children over many, many years who didn't know anything about their own history, even though they were living in the United States. A lot of white American kids who didn't know anything about what their forebears did or the extent to which they went, because nobody was teaching them. And most of them, it will come to them as a grave shock when they are taught these things. Also, I have the feeling that Barack Obama would never have become president if a lot of young white Americans hadn't voted for him. So there is a very generational component to the business of race relations and perceptions and beliefs and so forth. There are lots of young white Americans who are very open-minded now, who love African-American music and culture and so on and so forth. But the problem remains that economics are a legacy issue. You have people who have wealth over long periods of time. And at the end of the day, even the innocent younger ones who come from those upper middle classes are beneficiaries of that legacy. What do you do with that? How do you liberalize that? And of course, African Americans remain a minority numerically for now in the United States, even though the brown and black numbers are rising. So it is still possible for a white American to carry on their lives, middle class white American, without having to actually deal with black people or people from Latin America and so on and so forth, and see them almost like an abstraction. Now, a black person who is a minority in the United States doesn't have that kind of luxury.
Okay.
You must interact with white people in one capacity or another, whether it's the police or somebody else.
Lindsay, is it very hard for any nation, looking at this objectively as a journalist, is it very hard for any nation, whether it's people, in Germany coming to terms with their Nazi past, or people in America coming to terms with their slavery past, for them to say that my country or my grandparents committed really atrocious crimes, and accepting that that is part of one's national identity?
Well, yes, it must be difficult for the descendants of the perpetrators of the crime to admit that they gained or profited from a crime. But reality is reality, and one must face it. And indeed, the fact that the civil rights movement was in our lifetime it has been an element of reality for the nation, not only to admit that its past was built on a crime, but also to face that the correction of the consequences of the crime is an integral part of daily life. And once you admit that, then you accept that the whole business of development, of enjoyment of your national history includes accepting criminal culpability.
Let me bring Emeka in, because of course you taught for many years in America. You lived in America for many, many years. I mean, how do you see America's remembering or misremembering of slavery years and Reconstruction, particularly in the context of the experiences of African Americans today?
Well, I think that you are right, and so is Mr. Barrett, in talking about the culpability of the country and the fact that there is this sort of tension between wanting to acknowledge it and to deny the same thing. Even before African Americans came to the United States, which technically starts in 1619, Native Americans were virtually decimated genocidally in order to make space for Europeans to create a nation, or even starting with the colonies first in the place. So you had a tremendous tragedy that had occurred even before Africans were brought, and continued in the expropriation and exploitation of the labor of the Africans and on that terrible, cruel chattel slavery. So that was definitely there. Now, the beneficiaries of that, which are the generations that came later on, are likely to constantly deal with this cognitive dissonance between acceptance and trying to deny that situation.
Okay, let me just ask you to hold that thought. We'll come back to you. We've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the history and current status of race relations in America. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, it was that eminent black man of letters, W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 predicted that the issue of the coming century in America would be the problem of the color line. Well, many would say that he's been proven right, and that today, more than 100 years later, the race problem is America's greatest national dilemma and poses the biggest threat to the success of its democratic experiment. There is a certain relish in having a statue named Liberty overseeing the arrival in New York's harbor of millions of foreigners who Americans call aliens, tempest-tossed and yearning to breathe free. Even as black peasants, not alien, just profoundly alienated, we're kept unfree at the social margins. How could the so-called leader of the free world continue to be seen to preside over a regime of racial subordination? A sharp contrast between America's lofty ideals and the seemingly permanent second-class status of the African American. We'll chat some more about all that in a moment. But first, let's get to know a little bit about one of the earliest and most prominent civil rights activists in America, W.E.B. Du Bois.
William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, later known as W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, on February 23, 1868. As a young man, Du Bois received a B.A. from Fisk University before becoming the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1895.
What is impressive about W.E.B. Du Bois, when he went to Harvard, they wouldn't accept his 4-year Fisk degree. Du Bois also faced the problem of not being allowed to stay on the Harvard campus after 6 p.m. So if you put it in context historically, it was a great feat.
While teaching at Atlanta University, Du Bois produced a number of academic works, including The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, the first case study of a black community in the United States.
Du Bois went into these blighted areas. He found a population that had terrible health issues, a lot of social ills such as poverty, high infant mortality, prostitution. He didn't entirely excuse the African American population, but in his analysis, he was very forceful about pointing out racism as a reason for a lot of these ills.
Both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington emerged as advocates of their race. However, as an alternative voice to Washington's book, Up From Slavery, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903.
It was an absolutely unique book. It contains poetry, autobiographical sketches, historical articles, memoir, a wide-ranging representation of the diversity of black experience.
In 1905, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, opposing Booker T. Washington's racial accommodation theory. The organization became the forerunner of the NAACP, and years later, Du Bois was appointed editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis.
Du Bois wanted The Crisis to have two main components: protest on the one hand and uplift on the other. At the same time that he was protesting lynching and race riots, he was building a consciousness.
While continuing his work for civil rights, Du Bois published his first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, in 1911. 4 years later, he published The Negro, the first general history of black Africans.
He was one of the early scholars who felt like you could not understand the status and condition of blacks in the United States unless you came to terms with the status and condition of Africa.
In 1920, Du Bois published the first of his 3 autobiographies, entitled Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil. Then in 1935, Du Bois published his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America.
With his 3 autobiographies, and in a sense you could say his body of work, Du Bois gave us a document of what it was like to be black in the American century.
The great intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois there. Well, let's continue our discussion now about race relations in America. With me from our London studios, the African-American musician and rights campaigner Gregg Kofi Brown. In the Abuja studio, the author and professor of political science and black studies, Emeka Aniagolu, who for many years taught African and African-American history at Ohio Wesleyan University in the US, and the Jamaican Nigerian international journalist and African affairs analyst, Lindsay Barrett. Thanks for staying with us, and I'll come straight it back to you, Emeka, because we're talking about well, obviously race relations before we went on a break. We heard about the activists there, W.E.B. Du Bois. And as you look at activists in America, black and white, who are continuing to fight racism and work for reconciliation, re-examine American history from that perspective, how much are they up against the notion that, yes, we know there was slavery, but it was over in 1865, and what are they going on about now?
Well, I mean, the point of history is to look at what actually occurred. And the periodization of history is extremely important in understanding the dynamics as well as the dialectics between the different groups, government and citizens and so forth. It's important to remember that when the American Civil War ended in 1865, and the period that is called the Reconstruction began to occur, that there were quite a number of important strides that were made. I mean, the United States Constitution had 3 critical amendments to it: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. And each one was in favor of including African Americans into the American body politic. The first one, the 13th Amendment, officially banned slavery. The second one made them citizens. And the third one gave them the right to vote, particularly African American males, because both females, white and black females, had to wait for the right till 1920. But the Reconstruction got to a point where it was rolled back, because you're always having the dialectic first of white Southerners who were feeling very bad at the fact that they were defeated and that their ex-slaves were now being put somewhat on par with them, and those in the North who were in sympathy with them and those who were against them. So a time came when there was a particular president, United States president called Rutherford B. Hayes, that brought about what is called in American history the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877, which is actually when it's formally, when the process of the rollback of the Reconstruction began, where he literally made a deal with the white South to say, right, I'll pull out the federal troops and so on that were protecting the freedmen, African Americans, in exchange for your votes. And that was how the Reconstruction literally came to a grinding halt. And the white Southerners regained new powers to start the process of laying the foundation for what we call Jim Crow, or segregation.
So let me just ask you this, because you talked about the South, and even though we know that today racism in the US is not confined to the US South, nevertheless, is it fair to say that because of its own intense and, if you like, false awareness of its history, the US South magnifies the problem of racism in America?
Yes and no. In some ways, Southern whites in America are even more familiar with African Americans than Northerners. And when they went through that whole process, they are somewhat a bit more relaxed. Their culture is much more intertwined with African American history, the culinary culture and so on and so forth. And they are a lot more at ease in some ways culturally than even the North. The North, even though they didn't have the institution of slavery in the North, or it pitted out very early on in colonial America, they still have this sort of weird notion that New England states and so on are quintessential replantation of Europeans and so on.
Right. Okay. Let me just let me bring in Gregg Kofi Brown, who's in our studios in London. Thank you for your abiding patience, Gregg. But of course, slavery did not end in 1865, did it? I mean, it continued under sort of various guises well beyond that year. And when it eventually ended, it was just the beginning of the quest by black Americans for democratic equality.
Well, some would say that, you know, slavery still exists in terms of the freedoms and the laws that are available that are instituted against Black Americans, African Americans, and the prison system, the laws and the prison system still oppress and enslave African people in America.
Okay, let me bring in Lindsay Barrett, because of course you can go through the process of working off the past and so on, but is there a recipe that will work in the US towards working off that ignoble past, such as changing school lessons, changing public space? I mean, they're doing some of that in some places in America, thinking about statues and what to do about them, and of course communities coming together and talking about it.
Well, first of all, Charles, let me point out that in recent years, we've seen the terrible legacy of attitudes, such as what has happened where there are more Black people in jail for crimes that white people don't get put in jail for. Or if they do get put in jail, they may get 6 months, and a Black man for the same crime will be given 12 years. There's all that. Then there is the recent outburst of police brutality against
Yes,
Blacks.
we're going to actually get to that in a minute.
And what I'm saying is that attitudes have not changed to the extent that one would expect if America was genuinely democratic in its attitude towards people of different races. And in recent years, the election of Donald Trump has actually been a reaction because there was a Black man president. If Obama had never been president, Donald Trump wouldn't be president of Nigeria today. President of America.
Right. That's a very interesting point, and we will talk about that a little bit more, but we've got to take another break. Sadly, these things have to happen. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the history and current status of race relations in America. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, at some point, possibly in the 1960s, America's political elite were forced to choose between the nobility of their civic creed and the comfort of long-standing social arrangements. Ultimately, they chose the former, and thus began the remarkable transformation of American race relations after World War II. Official segregation, which as late as 1960, some Southerners said would live forever, died. Today, the ideal of equal opportunity is upheld by laws and universally embraced in politics. A large and stable black middle class has emerged, and black participation in the economic, political, and cultural life of America has expanded impressively. The caste system of social domination, enforced with open violence, has been eradicated. Or has it?
Election, there was talk of a post-racial America. And such a vision, however well intended, was never realistic. Race remains a potent and often divisive force in our society. Now, I've lived long enough to know that race relations are better than they were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, no matter what some folks say. You can see it not just in statistics, you see it in the attitudes of young Americans across the political spectrum. But we're not where we need to be. And all of us have more work to do. If every economic issue is framed as a struggle between a hardworking white middle class and an undeserving minority, then workers of all shades are going to be left fighting for scraps while the wealthy withdraw further into their private enclaves. If we're unwilling to invest in the children of immigrants just because they don't look like us, we will diminish the prospects of our own children, because those brown kids will represent a larger and larger share of America's workforce. And we have shown that our economy doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Last year, incomes rose for all races, all age groups, for men and for women. So if we're going to be serious about race going forward, we need to uphold laws against discrimination in hiring and in housing and in education and in the criminal justice system. That is what our Constitution and our highest ideals require. Regardless of the station that we occupy, we all have to try harder. We all have to start with the premise that each of our fellow citizens loves this country just as much as we do, that they value hard work and family just like we do, that their children are just as curious and hopeful and worthy of love as our own.
Barack Obama there delivering his farewell speech. Now let's continue our discussion about race relations in America. With me from our London studios, the African-American musician and rights campaigner Gregg Kofi Brown. In the Abuja studio, the author and professor of political science and black studies, Emeka Aniagolu, who for many years taught African and African-American history at Ohio Wesleyan University in the US, and the Jamaican Nigerian international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett. And Emeka, we heard Lindsay just before we went on a break talking about the reaction in America, Donald Trump being a reaction to the fact that Barack Obama was president. And of course, those conservatives today under Donald Trump appear to be having their populism empowered and, if you like, turbo boosted by Mr. Trump and by using the internet. Is it your sense that this extremely dangerous populist power is growing in America?
Yes and no. First of all, I think it's a bit of historical amnesia to think that it started just with the election of Donald Trump. I think it began with the problem of Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan, when he came to power in 1981, I think, was the person that officially began a systematic effort to roll back the gains of civil rights and non-white Americans in the United States. And he went about it rather openly and systematically. And not only in terms of African Americans, but even his foreign policy towards Africa and Africans was very clear. Even before he became president, when he was governor of the state of California, evidence later emerged of a telephone conversation he had with President Nixon at the time, in which he called African diplomats on that phone call monkeys.
Yes, I certainly remember that was a big news issue.
Yes,
here.
and that's only because it came out later on, because it was under seal for quite a while. And the reason being that the Africans at the United Nations voted to have the Chinese government of Beijing take its seat and to have Taiwan removed. And of course, the United States official foreign policy at the time was to be an ally of Taiwan against communist China. So even then, his viewpoint was very clear. And then when he became president, he had a series of things, in which he established lots of programs that he tried to down in terms of budget, financing of these things, and so forth and so on. And we all know in Africa here that he supported UNITA, Jonas Savimbi's insurgency against the MPLA in Angola, and was the one responsible for setting up the so-called constructive engagement policy towards apartheid South Africa, even though apartheid South Africa had already been named as a system that was a crime against humanity by the United Nations as far back as 1971. So the stage was set by him for what Trump will come along. There was always that sort of pocket of nativist, racist white Americans who needed to be tapped when the right person comes along. So he had set the stage for that, and then subsequently Trump has come along, and not really having any serious creative policies of his own. He's using this as a kind of theater.
That's a very interesting point. Let me bring in Gregg Brown, who's in our studios in London. And Gregg, I hope you can hear the discussion taking place here, because I'm sort of wanting to have you contribute from what you just heard Professor Emeka saying there. Because, I mean, this populist power in America, which a lot of people, Lindsay Barrett was talking about, we see coming out of the Trump era. I mean, can it be, to use the term, curated? Because, I mean, or is there no hierarchy curating it? Because it's anti-hierarchy, it's anti-elite, it's anti-foreigners, it's anti-racial harmony. What is your take on that?
Well, I think historically, it seems when African Americans rise and they commoditize their lives and their culture and their future economically and socially, there is always that element of the racist supremacists targeting those elements within our community. There's a story about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa that was, I think it was the 20s or 30s, that had amazing wealthy African Americans, and they were targeted by the right-wing supremacist elements and bombed and murdered. It was one of the largest racist attacks in American history. I think something like 300 to 600 people were murdered. Businesses were bombed. They bombed streets in, near Tulsa, Oklahoma, where this community thrived. So I find, like I said, historically it seems whenever African Americans made strides economically and socially, there was always an element to knock them back. And I mean, I've seen evidence where drugs were created and put into the African American community to distract and to alter the course that the community was striving towards. I knew a scientist who worked for the government that were creating drugs to put into the African community in the late 70s. That is one reason why I left America in 1980, because I could see where it was going in terms of giving empowerment to drug dealers and gangs. You know, it's almost like they glorified the negative elements of the Black community, of the African American community, and tried to systemically, erase the more positive aspects of the community.
Okay. Let me just bring Lindsay Barrett in. Unfortunately, we've got about a minute left before we have to take another break. But do you agree with some of what he said? I mean, like the phenomena that we are seeing in the United States today reminds us of 1933 and 1934 as the Nazi populism began to rise.
Definitely. The point that Gregg makes about historically, every time there seems to be a positive movement in certain aspects of Black aspirations, you see an equivalent resistance from the so-called Eurocentric American heritage. And it has turned out now, it has, my point, which I was making, although Emeka says it started earlier, but my point is that Trump is the most remarkable consequence of this attitude.
Okay.
It's an attitudinal thing.
We'll come back to you when we return. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the state of race relations in America. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, as you know, in recent years, some major American cities have experienced racial tension, which has erupted into violence. In August 2014, Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager, was shot and killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. The community reacted with violent protests, and when a few months later a grand jury decided not to indict the policeman, there was further violence. And another grand jury decided against prosecuting a policeman who was caught on video on Staten Island putting a chokehold on a black man. Eric Garner was heard screaming, "I can't breathe," and he subsequently died. And there have been many more similar incidents. The cases have raised questions about how much progress has been made in America towards creating a truly equal society. Well, with me from our London studios, the African-American musician and rights campaigner Gregg Kofi Brown. In the Abuja studio, the author and professor of political science and black studies, Emeka Aniagolu, who for many years taught African and African-American history at Ohio Wesleyan University in the US, and the Jamaican Nigerian international journalist and African affairs analyst, Lindsay Barrett. And straight away to you, Lindsay, because we've talked about a lot of the problems, but let's talk about the achievements in race relations in America since slavery and segregation. In the last 100 years, America has moved from hostility to black demands for equal citizenship rights to black participation at every level and in every venue. After the trauma of the past century, does that deserve to be celebrated?
Well, the move towards humanity of the American dream, which is symbolized by the increasing recognition of racial equality, is something to be celebrated, but also one should wonder why it has taken so long and why it was ever necessary. Historically, racism has been institutionalized by colonialism, actually. And
of course, coming from the Caribbean originally, I mean, they were victims of both slavery and colonialism.
And what we have seen is that the American issue, even today, now they are bringing up new issues of immigration, when in fact they are an immigrant nation. As our brother, Professor Emeka, made plain, and I must thank him for opening my eyes to the fact that even before the first African landed on the American soil, the American philosophy of superiority of some racial groups had worked to lead to the genocide of the people they met, whose land they've now taken, and which they now call home, is actually stolen land. And so this large crime goes beyond that of slavery to that of the genocide of non-white peoples. So while it is something to celebrate that we've made progress, we must also insist that we face reality and look at the whole legacy of the American dream as something that we must also regard as a crime that should never have been committed.
In other words, it's not time to rest. And just bringing in Professor Emeka there, because as anyone, vaguely aware of the social conditions in contemporary America knows, I mean, there is still a problem of the color line there.
Absolutely. Again, you have to excuse me for being a historian. I never want people to lose sight of the historical perspective because it makes us understand the transitions negatively or positively.
Absolutely.
President Woodrow Wilson, who was the 28th president of the United States, elected in 1913, was one of the people that also helped to make matters worse for African Americans. He was a very well-educated fellow, was, I think, president of one of the Ivy Leagues before he became a politician. Now, he appointed a very interesting man by the name A. Mitchell Palmer to be the United States Attorney General. And that fellow appointed another very interesting fellow called J. Edgar Hoover to be his special assistant.
That's a name that rings a lot of bells, doesn't it?
And using two United States legal instruments, the Espionage Act of 1918 and the Sedition, Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, they went after all of the groups that were agitating for equal change, civil rights or whatever, and went after W. Du Bois, you were talking about, went after Marcus Garvey, went after Malcolm X, the whole lot of them, through a program when J. Edgar Hoover became the head of the FBI, called COINTELPRO.
Absolutely.
Counterintelligence Program.
I wonder if that led to W.E.B. Du Bois moving to Ghana.
It did, because they accused him of being a communist and so on and so forth, seized his passport for a while, and then eventually he decided he had enough of it and left. And of course, all the disruptions of the African American civil rights movements, they infiltrated all of them, the Black Panther movement, the Nation of Islam, the whole lot of them. So these things came down the line to this day. Because at the heart of the problem is not whether people like each other. It's not whether white Americans have some African Americans who they consider friends or they don't mind. At the heart of it is about power and control, economic resources. And white Americans are afraid because the birth rate of non-whites in the United States is going up while theirs have stayed flat. That eventually America is going to become mostly black and brown, or brown and black.
And that's a point that Barack Obama made when he spoke just a few minutes ago. We've got about 3 minutes left. I'm hoping to get both Gregg Brown and Lindsay Barrett in. Gregg, let me come to you because, I mean, I presume you've been listening into the discussion so far. Looking at race relations in Donald Trump's America today, even after 8 years of Barack Obama, does the dream that race might one day become insignificant in America's civic life seem naively utopian from your point of view as an African American?
Well, I mean, as the professor was saying, if you look at the flashpoints historically in terms of how our culture has been attacked, which actually started in the 1500s when the Spanish wanted to get rid of the black Moors in Spain and the black Moors throughout Europe, and the Catholic Church basically they allowed slavery, Africans to be put into slavery. So I mean, if you look at the flashpoints, like that period, the period of slavery in America, the period of Jim Crowism, the period where the FBI made a concerted attack, and the CIA made concerted attacks against black communities and African communities. Because don't forget the CIA's role in destroying parts of African politics within Nkrumah, their whole campaign against Nkrumah when they were talking about Pan-Africanism. That was a threat to that power structure, that Anglo-American power structure that we are talking about.
Okay. Well, so, let me bring in. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Gregg, but we're almost out of time. Let me give the last word to Lindsay Barrett. How much concern do you still have that, should there be about what it says about American democracy and where it's at today with race relations? And we've got about 30 seconds.
Well, I'm not too worried about American democracy. What I'm more worried about is whether the African Americans can harness some economic strength that we in Africa can also interact with.
Okay, that's potentially a discussion for another day. Lindsay Barrett, Professor Emeka Aniagolu, and Gregg Kofi Brown, thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of The Arise Interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.